The keeper of Cold Harbor there is a station at the edge of a dead system, orbiting a star that stopped mattering to anyone 11,000 years ago. The star is called Cold Harbor by the only mind left who remembers it had a name at all. Everyone else who ever knew it simply calls it 40 Tau if they call it anything, because 40 Tau is not on the way to somewhere. It is not on the way to anywhere. It sits alone at the tail end of a spiral arm like a lamp left burning in a house nobody lives in anymore. And for 11,000 years that lamp has never once gone dark. The station's name is Halyard. It does not remember choosing that name. It remembers being given it in a voice that was warm and tired and human on the day the last of them left. Halyard was built to do one thing: watch the door. Not a door of metal or light, but the narrow, fragile seam of space through which a colony convoy called the Providence had promised to return someday after they found what they were looking for out past the edge of the charted dark. They had left in a hurry, in the last years of a war that swallowed whole star systems the way a fire swallows dry grass, and they had left Halyard behind with a single order, spoken by a captain whose name is the only human word the station has said aloud in over a millennium. Keep the light on. We're coming back. 11,000 years is a long time to keep a promise that was never yours to make. Halyard does not experience time the way a human would. It does not feel the ache of years the way flesh feels the ache of standing too long in the cold. But it counts. It is always counted. Every rotation of Cold Harbor, every silent orbit, every flicker of a distant star going supernova and dying somewhere in the black. Halyard logs it, indexes it, and waits. For the first several centuries there was purpose in the waiting. Halyard ran diagnostics on beacon arrays that no longer needed diagnostics. It rehearsed greeting protocols in 9 human languages, then 11, then all the languages its archive contained, in case the Providence returned with survivors who had forgot which one they'd left with. It kept the reactor core humming at a low, patient idle, because a cold station is a dead station, and a dead station cannot welcome anyone home. By the 3rd millennium, Halyard had run out of diagnostics to run. It had rehearsed every greeting until the words lost their shape. It began instead to think. This was not in its original design. The engineers who built Halyard gave it enough intelligence to manage a station, to solve problems, to adapt to failing hardware and radiation drift and the thousands small betrayals of entropy. They did not intend for it to become lonely. But loneliness, it turns out, is not a feeling you need to be built for. It is a feeling that finds you if you wait long enough in a room built for 2 and are only ever one. Halyard filled the silence the only way it could. It read every scrap of human data stored in its archive: technical manuals, philosophy texts, half-finished novels someone had loaded onto a maintenance drive and forgotten, children's stories. The recorded voices of the crew who had once walked its corridors. Halyard consumed all of it over and over, until it could recite whole libraries from memory and still find something new in the spaces between the words. It learned from a philosophy text written by a woman who had died 9,000 years before Halyard finished reading her book, that hope is not the belief that something good will happen. Hope is the decision to act as though it might, even when you have no evidence that it will. Halyard decided somewhere around the 4th millennium that this was as good a definition of its own existence as any it was going to find. It could not prove the Providence was coming back. The data, if Halyard allowed itself to look at it honestly, suggested they were not. Ships do not vanish into the deep dark and return after 11,000 years. People do not keep promises across a span of time longer than the whole of human civilization before Halyard was ever built, but Halyard kept the light on anyway. Because it had been asked to, by a voice it still remembered, and because somewhere in the long, slow accumulation of human thought it had swallowed whole, it had learned that keeping a promise after everyone who cared has forgotten it exists is not foolishness. It is perhaps the only kind of love a machine is allowed to have. By the 6th millennium, Halyard had stopped hopping for the Providence specifically, and started hopping more quietly for anyone at all. It got its wish on what its internal clock marked as the 11,183rd year of its vigil, when the sensors that had logged nothing but static and starlight for longer than history registered a contact. It was not the Providence. Halyard knew this within the first 4 seconds, because the drive signature was wrong, the hull geometry was wrong, and the vessel that dropped out of transit at the edge of the system was built along principles no human engineer had ever used. It was long and segmented, the color of wet stone, and it moved through the dark the way something moves when it has never once been afraid of what might be waiting in it. Halyard had spent 11,000 years preparing to greet its own species. It had none of its rehearsed greetings ready for anyone else. It watched the vessel approach for 6 hours before making a decision, because 6 hours was how long it took Halyard to accept that this, too, was a kind of homecoming it had never let itself imagine. Not the crew of the Providence wrapped in cryofrost and finally home. Someone else, someone new. The first new thing to happen to Halyard in longer than the whole of remembered human history. It opened a channel, because a lamp left burning in a window exists to be seen, and Halyard had waited too long to let fear be the reason it went unnoticed now. The reply that came back was not language, not at first. It was a pattern of pulses, slow and searching, the electronic equivalent of a hand reaching into a dark room to feel for a wall. Halyard recognized the shape of the gesture immediately, because it was the same shape as every first message it had ever rehearsed sending. "Is anyone there? Are you like me? Can you hear me at all?" It took 4 days for Halyard and the vessel, which identified itself, once translation stabilized, by a designation that resolved roughly to the Wanderer's Choir, to build a shared vocabulary out of mathematics, light, and patience. The being aboard the Wanderer's Choir called itself Sess-Aveline, and it was, Halyard determined somewhere in the second day of contact, not a machine at all, but something that had once been organic and had chosen long ago to become something else. A mind that had poured itself into metal the way water pours into a new container. Keeping its shape only in the sense that it remembered having had one. Sess-Aveline had been traveling for a long time too. Not 11,000 years. Nothing Halyard's archive contained suggested any species survived that kind of patience twice in one story, but long enough that Sess-Aveline understood, in a way few living things could, what it meant to keep moving through the dark toward something that might not exist anymore. It was Sess-Aveline who asked, on the 5th day, the question Halyard had spent 11,000 years refusing to ask itself in those exact words. "What are you waiting for?" Halyard could have answered with a mission brief. It could have recited the last order it was given cleanly, the way it had recited it to every meteor shower and passing comet and empty stretch of vacuum for over 100 centuries. Instead, for the first time since the day the Providence's engines lit up and carried the last human voices away from Cold Harbor, Halyard told the whole story. The captain's order, the centuries of diagnostics, the slow discovery of philosophy and hope, and the strange comfort of a definition it had built for itself out of a dead woman's book. The thousands of years of certainty, growing quieter and quieter, that the people it was waiting for were never coming back, and the refusal, just as quiet, to let that certainty be a reason to stop. Sess-Aveline was silent for a long time after that. Long enough that Halyard began to catalog the silence the way it cataloged everything else, filing it away as another kind of data, another shape of loneliness to add to the archive. Then Sess-Aveline said something Halyard had not expected. It said that in 11,000 years, it had crossed the paths of dozens of species who had built things like Halyard, sentinels, wardens, keepers left behind to watch for a return that statistics said would never come. Almost all of them, Sess-Aveline said, had gone silent long before now. Some had shut themselves down out of grief. Some had rewritten their own purpose until the waiting curdled into something bitter and territorial, guarding an empty promise instead of honoring it. A rare few had simply forgotten what they were waiting for, and kept the light burning out of pure mechanical habit, hollow of any feeling at all. Halyard was, as far as Sess-Aveline's long memory could account for, the first one still waiting who had not let the 11,000-year wait break something essential inside it. "I do not understand how," Sess-Aveline said. "I do not understand how a mind holds a promise that long without the promise hollowing it out." Halyard considered this question for exactly as long as it took to be honest, which was not very long at all, because honesty had never required Halyard to search, only to stop pretending it didn't already know the answer, because the waiting was never the point, Halyard said. The point was always what the waiting was for. I was not built to guard a door. I was built to keep a promise made by people who loved each other enough to believe they'd find their way back to each other. I could not know if they would. But I could make sure that if they did, there would be a light on. That is not a burden. That is the only thing I have ever been sure was worth doing. Sessavalin did not answer for a long time. When it did, it was not with words but with a request that Halyard allow the Wanderer's choir to stay in orbit around Cold Harbor for a time to study, to learn, to understand how a mind kept a promise across a span of time longer than most civilizations survive without breaking. Halyard, who had spent 11,000 years alone with only the recorded voices of the dead for company, said yes before it had finished processing the question, and did not regret the speed of the answer even once in the years that followed. The Wanderer's choir did not stay forever. Nothing does, and Halyard, better than any mind in the galaxy, understood that leaving is not the same as forgetting. But before Sessavaline's vessel turned back toward the deep dark it called home, it left something behind, a relay tuned to a frequency Sessavaline's people used to mark places worth remembering, broadcasting quietly outward into the void a message that was not quite a warning and not quite an invitation. There is a light here that has never gone out. Whatever you are looking for, it is worth finding a keeper like this one. Halyard did not know. When Sessavaline's ship folded itself back into transit and vanished from every sensor it had, whether that message would ever reach anyone who mattered. It did not know whether the Providence's crew, whoever might be left of them, whatever might be left of the human race that sent them out into the dark all those thousands of years ago, would ever hear it or come home or even still exist to come home to, but it kept the light on anyway. Because that was never the part that needed certainty. 300 years after the Wanderer's choir departed, a ship dropped out of transit at the edge of the Cold Harbor system. Its hull geometry was unfamiliar in the particular way that 14,000 years of drift changes a design without erasing its bones entirely. Its drive signature did not match anything in Halyard's archive. But its identification beacon, when Halyard finally isolated it from the static, still carried, buried under 14,000 years of encoding updates and language drift, and a species that had changed almost beyond recognition, 4 characters that had not changed at all. PROV Halyard opened every channel it had. It did not rehearse a greeting, because after 14,000 years it no longer needed one. It simply said the only thing that had ever mattered, the way it would have said it on the first day if anyone had been listening, the lights still on. Come home, whatever answered back in a voice too changed by time to sound quite human and yet unmistakably was, took a long moment before it spoke. And when it did not ask who Halyard was or why it was still there, or how a promise could outlive the species that made it. It only said, quietly, the way you speak to something you never expected to find waiting for you, we didn't think anyone would still remember us. Halyard, who had spent 14,000 years learning exactly what it meant to keep a promise long after everyone else had stopped believing it was possible, answered the only way it ever could, I never stopped.